Now that we're past this, moving into this new phase of the campaign, what do you think these candidates are now going to be increasingly focused on as we head into the holidays and into an era, a time when debates may matter a little bit less?
It is absolutely the time where they need to target their states and then target their voters within the states to be sure those voters are going to come out and vote for them. There's going to be a lot of messaging geared at particular segments of the Republican primary electorate, especially in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada.
Bill, and thinking about the Republican side, you've spent a career making a lot of TV ads. John Kasich had a little bump in New Hampshire with ads. You've seen Jeb Bush, Super PAC ads, not move his numbers in the right direction. The airwaves are going to be increasingly crowded. If you were working for one of these Republican candidates or Super PACs, would you think you could drive poll numbers in the early states with paid media on television?
It's very hard to do it with early media. People have had success late with media giving them a spike, but early media seems to just evaporate. It doesn't really last. Even in case that you got a slight little bump, it sort of evaporated very quickly. So having firepower on the media side at the end is very important, and particularly in the four early states. Having real points, you know, what we suffer from is media fragmentation. It's hard to get a message across. Having big rating points at the end really matters.
Well, what does the end mean? If Iowa's February 1st, is the end the last 2 weeks? And won't the airwaves have 12 different Super PACs and 15 different candidates on the air? How do you break through that?
Well, I think it means the last month, basically, is when you need media, and that includes social media and radio, anything, cable, anything you can buy. The other thing about the Super PACs, they're going to pay much, much higher rates than the candidates are. So it's very important that the candidates not depend on the Super PACs. They're not going to be disciplined in the way they buy, and they're going to pay a hell of a lot of money for their advertising.
Ben, you know the way the Republicans think. I'm curious about how soon you think that Mr. Rubio, who's seen a little bit of this already, but how soon Mr. Rubio is going to start to see a lot of negative incoming over the air that Bill was talking about. When does that start?
About 6 weeks from Iowa, maybe mid-December with a little pre-Christmas present for Iowans, but it's going to be a very heavy January, I think, for the negatives. And
you think, Ben, that there's been obviously some hints in the press leading into this debate that Mike Murphy is going to be moving increasingly away from the positive strategy, the right to rise strategy. Let's talk about Jeb's Florida record. Mike, obviously famous for his negative advertising history. Do you imagine that what we're going to see coming out of right to rise is going to be mostly negative over the course of the couple months right before the caucuses?
Well, that is sort of the more proven pattern. I mean, one interesting thing to think about is the March 15th Florida winner-take-all primary. If you're either Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, you have to win that. And so does that affect the amount of dollars you have early on in the early states?
Ask you both, starting with Bill. On the Republican side, you see clearly Ted Cruz is more focused on Iowa than New Hampshire. Clearly Chris Christie is more focused on New Hampshire and Iowa. And yet they both can continue to visit the other state. There's almost no candidate now who's specializing in the major candidates. Bill, is it smart for them to keep hedging their bets? Or if you worked for Cruz, would you say stop going to New Hampshire? Christie, stop going to Iowa?
I think since '88, what we've seen in both parties in Iowa and New Hampshire tend to be one campaign now because of earned media. If you're in Iowa, you're going to get covered in Boston market and the New Hampshire markets. If you're in New Hampshire, you're going to get covered in Iowa. It's inevitable. So you got to think of that as actually one campaign, and you got to make sure you're doing what you need to do in one state to help you in the other one. And it's just inevitable. I would say one thing about the early timing. Back in '88, once upon a time when I was running presidential campaigns with Dick Gephardt, when he won in '88, we went on the week before Christmas in Iowa on television. We were the only ones on by ourselves. So I think you got to also think out of the box about how to do this. And what Ben's point about the Southern Super Tuesday, the so-called SEC primary, you got to think out of the box about what markets you're going to target and how you're going to do them and where you're going to play. We've seen people do that very cleverly in the past, and we've seen people bungle it.
Ben, should Chris Christie keep going to Iowa, or should he focus on New Hampshire?
I think he should keep going to Iowa, and here's why. Because Iowa and New Hampshire are going to be as much about exceeding expectations as they are actually winning the state. That's a function of the calendar changing and the March 1st Super Tuesday states being proportional rather than winner take all. Much harder to put it away, and a burst of momentum for Chris Christie finishing fourth in Iowa will carry over into New Hampshire. Same if Jeb Bush exceeds expectations in one of those states.
Let me ask another one of these double-barreled questions again, starting with Bill and then moving to Ben, and maybe our last Republican question before we shift over to talk about some Democratic stuff. Ben Carson, Donald Trump, clearly at the head of the pack in both places. What are those two guys who've campaigned in very non-traditional ways over the course of the campaign so far? What do they need to do between now and, say, Christmas? What ways would you advise them to change their approach in terms of retail politics, advertising, whatever you like? Start with you, Bill.
Well, I think last night we saw a little evidence, particularly with Trump, that this is getting out of his box. I mean, this was moving pretty fast last night, and the growth of Cruz and Rubio as communicators is really putting him in a bind. Also, last night when we shifted to substance, and that was the point, as much of Fox trying to position themselves, Fox Business News, but when they did that, it advantaged Cruz and Rubio. So I thought it was the velocity was a little much for Trump last night. We're going to see if he's really capable of running a campaign as opposed to being the circus coming to town. Is he going to be a serious candidate for president? I've never thought he was going to disappear overnight. I always thought he and Carson, they're more likely to disintegrate gradually.
Ben, what do you think? If you were advising those two guys, would you say, hey guys, time for some retail politics now. Time to start spending some time really on the ground to a much larger extent than you have in those first two states, or you guys might be in trouble.
Well, I'm not sure they're going to be in trouble, but yeah, I'd spend more time on the ground. One of the things about there only being one Republican debate between now and Christmas means that substance, being tested on the substance, is not likely to come. And so both Trump and Carson have shown themselves to be able to put on big events to attract large crowds with big followings. The lack of there only being one debate for 6 weeks now is going to spell this out into great detail.
Bill, a couple weeks ago when we did focus groups in New Hampshire, a lot of people there, Democrats, thought Bernie Sanders would win the New Hampshire primary. The Hillary Clinton inevitability meme is back in force. And this other press narrative that Sanders' campaign will rise or fall and just how negative he's willing to go on Hillary Clinton is, I think, bedeviling his campaign. What does Bernie Sanders need to do beyond this question of Hillary Clinton's inevitability, beyond the question of does he attack her, to position himself to win Iowa and or New Hampshire?
Well, I think this goes for both parties. Ben said Carson and Trump have been able to draw big crowds. Here's what you got to do in Iowa. You got to draw little crowds in 99 counties in each precinct. And they better all be organized, because I think Sanders, we got to see if he's organized, because he's been able to draw big crowds. Is he going to be organized at the precinct level? Is Trump or Carson, Cruz, Rubio, even Hillary, are they going to be organized at the precinct level? It's a hell of a task, and we'll find it'll be a big test for all of them, because this is a campaign, with the exception of Hillary, nobody's really run before, so we don't know what their capacity for true organization is. We know they come from states like Texas and Florida where that doesn't really matter. So that is a big test for all these candidates. How are they going to organize Iowa? Because it's tough.
Ben, let me ask you, there is a debate on the Democratic side coming up real soon out in Iowa, just coming up this weekend. If you're advising Bernie Sanders, as Mark said, this question of how negative to go and how to be negative and how to draw contrasts has bedeviled him to some extent for the last few weeks. What's your advice to him if you're doing debate prep with Bernie Sanders for how to handle this debate on Saturday?
I think it's pretty clear that he does need to draw contrasts. You asked the question before about the negativity on Marco Rubio and when it would come. It's a similar question about Mrs. Clinton. Somebody's got to if you're Bernie Sanders, you need to change up the current dynamics of the race. It's not going well. So the classic way to do that is through negative advertising and drawing contrasts in debates. So I think if he really wants to win, you're going to see that.
Bill, last question for you. What would you list as Hillary Clinton's 3 biggest vulnerabilities right now against Bernie Sanders on issues?
On issues, I think he obviously has done a good job of positioning himself as anti-Wall Street, playing into the anti-corporate feelings in the Democratic base. That's one. Because of Secretary Clinton's history in the Democratic Party and knowing a lot of people, powerful people who are very generous donors, she's got some vulnerability there. I think organizationally, we don't know if they're going to make the adjustments. Presumably they will. This time they didn't have in 08 when they got out organized in the early stage. They really have to focus on that. And I think the other thing is she's got a pretty good temperature. She's pretty cool right now. She's an effective campaigner right now, and she's got to maintain that. And that's going to be difficult because I totally agree with Ben. The big challenge for Bernie is he's going to have to draw a contrast. He's going to have to make this a choice and not just a referendum or a popularity contest between two Democrats that Democratic base voters like.